former Defense Department spokesman for the Western Hemisphere in the Office of Secretary of Defense, serving under both Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and Secretary Robert Gates. You're a retired naval officer, and you have been you do speaking all around the country, and you are a contributing commentator to Fox News, The Washington Times, Human Events, and others. But J.D., so I could go on and on, but we have you on here today really to talk with you about an article that you had just had published in The Washington Times entitled "Obama Loses His Cool in Europe." And when I first saw that, I thought, was there a moment of anger on the part of Barack Obama that I just overlooked? And maybe there was, but you were really talking about more the fact, I think, that once the cool, in quotes, Obama, who drew great crowds in Europe with very high favorability ratings, has slid there like he has here. And I suspect that there are numerous reasons why Europeans are looking less favorable at Barack Obama. But if you could tell our listeners, J.D., what do you think is the primary reason why Barack Obama has lost his sheen in Europe?
Well, thank you very much, Sam. And it was great to see you down here in Washington at the Value Voters Summit. I always appreciate seeing great friends. Those are like old reunions every year, and I enjoyed seeing you down here in D.C. for that. About my column, yes, the editors and I had talked about it, about Uncool Obama. That was the working title for it, because when I went to Europe, I was in Europe for the past couple weeks, and I did a think tank tour, and I was in several different countries, and I spoke at different think tanks. And basically, the impression I came away with, and I heard an earful from senior government officials in current governments, past governments, think tank leaders, the media, pundits, and it was overwhelmingly negative about President Obama and about why he disappointed so many people in Europe. You know, he was one of the coolest guys in Europe. In 2008, he spoke to 200,000 people in Berlin. He captivated the whole continent, and his approval ratings were between 80 and 90%. So when I got back from Europe, I decided that my first order of business was to write this column for the Washington Times. We had talked about it from Europe, Uncool Obama. Then I looked at his poll numbers from Pew, and I found that he's still polling over 50% in Europe. So we couldn't really call him uncool. That's why we had to say Obama loses his cool in Europe.
Well, that's interesting. Here, he's lost it because there's been a tremendous depreciation of trust. People heard what was said, hope and change, and everybody felt good about it. And I would imagine, J.D., that in Europe, where over a history, since World War I and II, when over 75 million were killed around the globe in those two wars, that Europe really came out of that saying, we don't want any more war. And they yielded to NATO, they yielded to the U.S. and so forth, and they've looked to us for their security. Do you think it's a matter of them losing trust in what what America has normally done for the protection of Europe? Is it there, or is it something else?
No, I think you're right on the mark, Sam. I think it has a lot to do with trust. I think the Europeans just don't trust Obama anymore. I wrote in the column about how the world lost 75 million people between World War I and World War II. So Europe became very traumatized. And basically, ever since the Second World War, ever since that calamity, basically what Europe did is they tried to put an emphasis on human rights and basically personal liberties above all else. And they really relegated the military piece down to basically the U.S. defense umbrella. And so that sounds great in theory. And when President Obama when he campaigned to office, he was music to their ears because he said things like being a global citizen, imagining a world without nuclear weapons, working towards that, closing Guantanamo, getting out of Iraq. He sounded great to the Europeans. But here's what happened. Then he had to rule. And then basically as a president, he has to defend the United States. And then basically what you saw is the drone strikes that went 6 times the amount of what President Bush used. 3,000 people killed in places like Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia with drone strikes without a hearing, including 4 U.S. citizens, by the way. So that was really the first big erosion of trust. President Obama talked all of these great things about peace and harmony and no nuclear weapons, and then he increased the drone strikes more than 6 times than President Bush did. That's number one. Number two, I think that it's important to see that the NSA surveillance program has been catastrophic for both President Obama's reputation and our reputation in Europe. I think the NSA surveillance program, it has some good aspects about it, too, because it protects us against terrorist attacks. But then again, there's no transparency, and these leaks by Edward Snowden just shocked the European continent. It shocked Europeans so much so that Angela Merkel had her phone tapped in the past, and all these ugly revelations came out. Revelations, rather. So I think what you saw is Europe, basically, they were lulled by Obama, they swooned over him, and then they saw how he governed. Guantanamo didn't close. Certainly it's not his fault, and I'm glad it didn't close, but Republicans prevented it from closing, which is a good thing. Otherwise, we would have had even more terrorist attacks. But they also saw that his rhetoric didn't make any sense. How could you say you want to close Guantanamo? How could you complain about 3 guys who were waterboarded thousands of times and then kill 3,000 people with missile strikes? It didn't make any sense. So I think the Europeans saw this hypocrisy in that, and that's one of the reasons why his poll numbers have dropped so dramatically, down from far down from 90 and 80% where they used to be in 2008.
Well, JD, historically, part of what has permitted the United States to be the leader of the free world has been that we have been good to our word, and trust has been a critical factor, and we've historically, in my opinion, had the moral high ground. To what degree do you think the stumbling and all of this nonsense that happened with the Syria build-up, to which then he could not garner, made statements, couldn't follow through, all that kind of thing, and then Vladimir Putin steps in from Russia, plays the peacemaker role, and really walks away, in my opinion, with the moral high ground? Was that a major factor in what you're seeing happening in Europe?
Yes, I think those are factors, too. I think that the Europeans understand that Russia is a force to be reckoned with. I think they saw it as very naive, what President Obama tried to do with the reset button through Hillary Clinton. Remember giving that reset button in 2009? The Russians haven't changed one bit. We've got a senior fellow at my think tank, Center for a Secure Free Society, Evgeny Novikov, and he was a senior official in the communist government of Russia, defected. He wrote a book for us just last year called Rethinking the Reset Button, Understanding Russian Contemporary Foreign Policy. Yevgeny's an older guy. He's a contemporary of Vladimir Putin. He knows these people. And Yevgeny says these guys haven't changed at all. The only reason they got rid of communism is because they couldn't afford to keep up with the buildup that we had under President Reagan, number one. And number two, they wanted to enrich themselves personally. And if you're a communist government, it's very hard to become a billionaire without people saying you're a hypocrite. So basically, Russia jettisoned that system. But they're still the same type of rivals we have. So I think the Europeans see that as weakness on behalf of President Obama, that Vladimir Putin, President Putin, gets the best of President Obama and our administration all the time. He bullies his neighbors like the Ukraine we're seeing right now, where he's basically forcing them to stay out of the European Union and being close to Russia. He's bullied Belarus over petroleum. He even invaded Georgia in 2008. He did not deserve a reset button. So I think the Europeans see that as very naive with Russia. With Syria, here you had President Obama and Secretary Kerry basically complaining so much about President Bush and criticizing the Bush administration for what they called a unilateral approach to Iraq. Never mind the fact that we had a coalition of over 30 for Iraq. But then basically Kerry and Obama made the point that we should have unilateral military strikes on Syria. The Europeans were just beside themselves. I heard from so many people who are members of parliament, members of the media, and academic types, professors, think tank experts when I was in Europe, asking me, how could President Obama think that he could have this unilateral action, these missile strikes on Syria, when he was the guy complaining so much about President Bush in Iraq, when he made such a big deal to get out of a war in Iraq, when he could have led us just into a war in Syria? They just don't understand it. And the reason they don't understand it is because it doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely. JD, hold that. We're going to break away. We're going to come back right after the break here.
JD, I got to ask you something. In a way, I wish our leaders were a little bit more like Vladimir Putin, where Putin puts Russia first, and he doesn't really care too much about what the rest of the world thinks of him. Right. George Bush was not popular in Europe, where Barack Obama, when he became president, had a 90% approval in Europe. But should our leaders care about how popular they are in Europe or around the world, or should they put our country first and our interests first, much like Vladimir Putin does?
Well, it's a great observation, Rick. You know, I was on ABC Washington, D.C. On Friday, and the host of the show, Morris Jones on Capital Insider, asked me if I thought Vladimir Putin was going to go down in history as a great leader. And I said no, but he's going to go down in history as a strong leader. And if you're given a choice, hopefully you want a great and a strong leader, but if you can only have one, I'd take the strong leader any day. I think that it's important to have countries like the United States to trust us. I think that's important, but I don't think that should be the only factor. I think that it's very important to realize that right now we are at a crossroads in the United States and Europe, and the reason is because of our financial crises on both sides of the Atlantic. We are looking at $1 trillion in defense cuts in the U.S. over the next decade, which includes sequestration, which is a 10-year program. And right now we've got over 280 ships. That would go down to 230. About 20% of our 5,000 Air Force aircraft would be cut. So we're talking massive cuts. It's about 200,000 ground troops over the next decade if those cuts are made. And Europe has similar problems because they also have financial crises in each of the countries there. Some worse than others, obviously, in places like Greece and Spain and Portugal. But the bottom line is, both the U.S. and Europe, the European Union, we stand for free markets, we stand for the rule of law, we stand for liberty, we stand for personal freedoms. They don't stand for those kind of things in places like Iran, in China, North Korea. Those are totalitarian states. Even in Russia, basically it's a kleptocracy. Russia's a mafia state. People don't have as much freedom in Russia as they do in Western Europe and the United States. That's why we have to make sure we're spending in our own defense, because if we're not, we're going to be bullied and dominated by countries like Iran, Russia, China, because those countries don't share our values. So my point is, one of my points for the column is, Europe has to pay more money for their own defense. They are getting away with basically providing their security blanket for them through NATO since the end of World War II. That's got to stop. The Europeans have got to start paying more money for their own security because we're going broke in this country too. We're all broke. But who's going to stand up to a nuclear-armed Iran? Who's going to stand up to a dictator like Putin should he become more aggressive? And which he will be, by the way, because all of Russia's demographics are going down the tubes. There's about 1 million HIV-positive people in Russia right now.
Wow.
Russia, it's horrible. Russia is also got 20% of a Muslim population from the south part of Russia that wants to break away and be independent. Places like Dagestan and Chechnya. These are the people doing terrorist attacks in places like Moscow. Moscow's got so many unfavorable demographic factors. In order to rally the base, guess what? Putin's going to be lashing out at neighbors and even us.
JD, I think you're probably pretty correct. Let me ask you another question here. Because of the, and we had some discussion with an earlier guest on this about the importance of the European Union and changes that are happening there more or less, because they put themselves, they've been wanting to, gain economic superiority and be able to position themselves against Russia, against the Far East, and so forth. Even in the United States, there was a suggestion put out that, in fact, that the European Union and the central bank that operates in close proximity with the Federal Reserve and our nation, that they, in a macro sense, are being pushed to expand and enlarge themselves even more, while at the same time, as you're talking about, we're being diminished, be it because don't have the money or the president who has policies that are diminishing us. The sense that we become subservient to the European Union rather than the way it has been where we've been their caretaker, they actually expect us to come under them. Do you see changes happening of that magnitude?
Well, I think that the EU is certainly enlarging. I mean, this whole bid for Ukraine, which have sparked all these street protests and clashes in Kiev, is part of that. The EU is trying to expand. The EU is trying to be the world's heavyweight. But the EU is not aggressive. The EU is not expansionist as far as expansionist in the terms of putting forces somewhere else and conquering other people. Like Iran would be, for instance. Iran's talked about wiping Israel off the map, etc. It's a hostile regime. North Korea is a hostile regime. But the EU is not that way. Certainly the EU wants to be the world heavyweight, but they don't want to dominate the United States militarily. They don't want to dominate our ideas or change anything. There are a lot of people in the world these days that are radical Islamists in the Middle East and in Iran that actually do want to control the world, that want to change the whole world order right now and top it on its head. The EU is not looking to do that. Sure, the EU wants to be stronger, but by the same token, the EU is not investing in their militaries. So, I mean, they're economically strong, but as far as the military goes, they're weak links, I mean, compared to what we have. My whole point is, since the U.S. and the EU, we share values, we share the love of freedom, we share the love of free markets. If our countries aren't strong militarily to defend those values, to defend freedom, personal liberties, free markets, rule of law, who's going to defend them? Nobody. They'll be taken over. They'll be bullied in the long histories that we've seen and the long time we have to go. I just think that the U.S. and the EU could be dominated by radical Islamist powers, by bullies like we see in Russia, by nuclear crazy regimes like in North Korea, and we have a rising China right now. Basically, that's a totalitarian regime too. People have more economic freedom in China now with their model of communism, but it's still a totalitarian system. People don't have any real freedom in China. So I think our values are threatened in the U.S. and the EU. That's why we have to put our money into defense, because if we don't put money in defense, we could be bullied by other countries that don't share our love for freedom.
Yeah, well, that's the whole point. This weakness will invite the type of aggression that we have fought against for so long. We only have a few minutes left here. J.D., I want you to comment on one other thing here in Europe. It wasn't in your article per se, but it still talks about Europe's circumstance. The movement of Ukraine to go back under Russia. Does that have anything to do with, I mean, what does that speak to you about, what does that tell us in the larger sense here?
Well, I think the Ukraine sees that the EU has a much better economic system. It's more transparent. They actually believe in the rule of law. Russia's like a mafia state, and Russia doesn't want to lose Ukraine. It's their neighbors, and, you know, Ukraine obviously was a big part of the Soviet Union before, so Russia doesn't want to lose its sphere of influence. So if you talk about the countries in the massive countries in Eastern Europe along Russia's border, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia doesn't want to lose them. So basically they try this petro-diplomacy, and they push them all around. The Ukraine had been trying to join the EU because they would benefit economically. The Ukrainians would have more jobs. They would grow their economy. But Russia put the brakes on that by internal influence, basically to make sure that Ukraine stays in their orbit so they could buy their goods. And it's going to hurt Ukraine's economy, of course, not to join the EU. That's what it's all about. It's about Russia's power play because they don't want to lose any influence with their neighbors.
Okay, well, J.D., we'll finish it right there for right now. Tell our listeners where to go to follow you and your writings, please.
My Twitter is Jeffrey_Gordon, and my website is protectamericatoday.com.